I'd like to first welcome everyone for coming. Thank you, everyone. Hi, Janai. Now, firstly, I would like to welcome faces new and old. Thank you for joining us today. And for those who are new and who are joining us for the first time, welcome. I would like to give an introduction about MLN first. The Movement of Liberation from Nakba is a coalition of organizations and individuals from various different countries, such as Australia, India, Malaysia, New Zealand, Pakistan, South Africa, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and many more. And our goal as an organization and as a coalition is to disseminate knowledge about Palestine in areas and spaces termed as the Global South. The goal of MLN is to educate and create awareness about historical Palestine, the 1948 Nakba, and the Palestinian minority inside Israel, the occupied West Bank, and the besieged Gaza Strip. Our goal is to serve as a platform for informed analysis of the Palestinian struggle against Zionist colonization. And today, in advance of that goal and in support of that goal as well, I cannot think of two more prominent intellectuals who are joining us in discussion about their book titled Our Vision for Liberation, Engage Palestinian Leaders and Intellectuals Speak Out. The book sets out to challenge several strata of the current Palestinian discourse that have led to the present dead end, the American pro-Israel political discourse, the Israeli colonial discourse, the Arab discourse of purported normalization, and the defunct discourse of Palestinian factions. Now, we will be drawing from the insights of our respective speakers today, Dr. Ramzi Baroud, as well as Professor Ilan Pape. And these two will be serving as a insightful resource into understanding the Palestinian struggles, and also not only about its current state, but also what is to be done in a manner that reflects not only Palestinian aspirations, but the view of what is possible when it comes to advancing the Palestinian cause. Now, with that, I would like to pass the floor to our respective speaker to initiate the discussion. Firstly, to Professor Pape, and after that to Dr. Ramzi Baroud. And after the discussions, we will have a Q&A session, which will give everyone the opportunity to essentially ask any questions to our respective speakers. Professor Pape, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hassanel, and thank you everyone for joining us. Before we start this very important session, I hope you don't mind all joining me in a short minute of silence to one person who was very crucial in creating this particular network, the Movement for Liberation from Nakba, and who unfortunately and sadly passed away recently. Without his support, inspiration, and leadership, we would have not been able to push forward this very important project of disseminating knowledge on Palestine beyond the West, beyond the United States and Europe, into Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Africa. And he was mentor to so many of us. And this is Professor Yong Bok Kim. And we are all in debt to his leadership, inspiration, and courage. And we miss him very much. And I think we will continue the work that we're doing for Palestine as a legacy and testimony to his personality and incredible contribution to humanity in South Korea and beyond. He was a true friend of Palestine, and he saw Palestine as epitomizing the struggle for justice and freedom in the world at large. And I hope that he left behind it, and I'm sure he left behind him also a younger generation of South Korean and people in Southeast Asia in general who will continue to work with us for the liberation of Palestine. So I will be silent now for just a very short minute in honoring his memory and his legacy. Thank you very much for joining me in this moment of prayer and remembrance. I also want to say that before we start, we should also remember the recent martyrs who died in the West Bank victimized by a new brutal Israeli assault on the Palestinians in Jenin, in East Jerusalem, and in Nablus. And as we speak, young Palestinians are trying to protect Al-Aqsa Mosque and the West Bank from a new Israeli assault on Palestinian dignity, life, and property. And our thoughts are with these young people and their continued struggle for liberation and justice. And we'll see how these things develop. And of course, if any of you want to raise this also as a question or a comment in our discussion, we would be very happy also to comment on the present reality. Let me now move to our joint project, the book, which is the main reason for our meeting today. The Palestinian struggle for liberation takes many forms and is based on diversified modes of resistance. This struggle is usually and understandably described as a collective effort of a nation that was colonized in the late 19th century and is still under occupation and colonization today. Since the struggle continues, it is useless to make any reasonable judgment of success or failure. The story is not over yet. Far more important in our mind is to record and recognize the individual struggles that form this collective effort. They sometimes are forgotten or overlooked, but they are crucial for understanding why those who are part of the liberation struggle and those who support the liberation struggle have not given up hope for its eventual success in the future. When Dr. Ramzi Baroud and I decided to record these individual stories of struggle for freedom and liberation, we first hoped to have a full picture of the personal contribution and experience of each contributor. I would say also their personal sacrifices that they made in the struggle for liberation. But we were fortunate enough to receive much more than that. Each individual tale has a biographical section in the book that opens a window to a more distant, a more recent Palestinian past in the homeland or in exile. This is very much about what was lost as a result of the ongoing catastrophe, Nakba, as much as it is about what was regained by sheer resilience, steadfastness, which we call in Arabic sumud, and commitment. Take, for instance, our opening chapter by Hamdan Tah, that assesses the role of Palestinian archaeologists and archaeology in the struggle for liberation. It begins with a glimpse into the life of a 12-year-old village boy on the day of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank in June 1967. In a moving passage in the chapter, Hamdan tells us how this boy, a later teenager, became one of Palestine's leading archaeologists. It was his first encounter with a new oppressive reality imposed by the occupation that set him off to his incredible career. Even today, Hamdan has to struggle daily against an archaeological narrative of denial and erasure. This sinister campaign is not only done through distorting ancient historiography, but also by the production of a misleading discourse and the invention of a deceptive vocabulary. Struggling against his misrepresentation of the past, of this misrepresentation of the past and present realities in Palestine through language is an essential part of our next contributor, Ibrahim Odin, and his life story. His professional commitment brings to the fore the role of discourse and language in the liberation struggle. This is a professional life devoted to countering a Zionist vocabulary that sustained the denial of the Palestinian existence from the very start. Ibrahim's professional activity was and is supplemented by what he calls extracurricular activity. Jointly, this twin effort is Ibrahim's particular mode of cultural resistance, which is performed day in and day out. And finally, in this century, as he tells us, has produced some tangible and encouraging results. The public domain is influenced by this discourse, and it is mainly in the media that disseminates it, hence the crucial role media plays in the struggle for liberation of Palestine. Our contributors who work in the media domain tell a life story that will encourage young Palestinians, so we hope, to follow suit and become influential journalists and media persons in the future. It seems that one trajectory that led our contributors to play such a role in the local and global media is their educational background. Their early life was shaped by education provided at home and school before the Nakba. But in the Palestinian case, often one has to be self-taught and learn through sheer personal determination, as can be gleaned from stories of Qassam Ali Kafarne's story and others in our volume. Qassam shared with us this moment he undertook the road to become one of Palestine's leading journalists, and I will quote shortly from his passage. The next part of my journey turned out to be a formative and fundamental ingredient to my engaging meaningfully with journalism as a powerful tool in the struggle for liberation. It was a journey digging to the roots of my people, collecting their experiences of life, debating on political visions, disagreeing on ideology, religion, cultural constructs, end of quote. It was both formal and informal education that prepared him for his role as the leading journalist in the future. One such informal site was the Israeli prison, and I quote again, the crucible blending and catalyzing our nationalism, uniting us as a people, erasing gender, socioeconomic, religious, and ideological barriers, and all of this provided on a civil platter by our Israeli oppressor, the prison. Many of our contributors dwelled on the choices they made in becoming so deeply involved in the struggle for liberation. Our next contributor, who also plays a crucial role in the media struggle, Sama Abu Shahrar, ponders in this respect about choices Palestinians make in the struggle of liberation. And I quote, "We are often told that our life choices are those of our making. In the case of most Palestinians, I believe it is a luxury that we often dare not indulge in." And yet, as Sama's chapter shows, a destined role not chosen, but accepted, led to a pioneering work in building media outlets and bastions of professional journalism, which secured at the center of people's awareness and cognition of the Palestinian plight, and in particular, shed constant light on the Palestinian refugees' right of return. This is not a mere achievement, given the attempts to deny this right by a huge Israeli propaganda machine oiled with Western help and support. The sense of belonging and recognizing your identity as a Palestinian due to historical circumstances occurs everywhere in the globe. This is illustrated by one of our next contributors, Anwar Majlouf, who tells the story of Club Deportivo Palestino, one of the best football clubs in the continent of South America. In the context of the liberation struggle, it is a tale of solidarity and support of young people, such as footballers, who have it all now, but do not forget their roots. This is one of the most successful football clubs in the world, and they identify with the nation through its most difficult time. Their support will make sure that abnormal realities of occupation and colonization would not deny the joy and crucial importance of sport in the Palestinian life and future. Indeed, being a Palestinian out of Palestine for most of one's life does not diminish a bit one's commitment and contribution to the liberation struggle. This is a struggle that is persistent and faces constant attempts to deny its legitimacy. Such a particular struggle is recounted by one of our next contributors, familiar to many of you, I'm sure, Dr. Radha Karmi, who really held the fort of Palestinian representation in the 1970s and 1980s in Britain. Radha recalls an incident when she was invited to tell her life story in a special session where people were asked to do so, share with others their life story. She was censored by the organizers, since a Palestinian life story might be provocative or offensive. And this occurred in London, not under a callous dictatorial regime, rather devoted and still devotes her life to ensure that Britain does not forget Palestine and its own role in its catastrophic history. At times, it was a lonely struggle. Later, it was carried out in tandem with others, and all of it is part of the struggle of the PLO since its inception and until the 1980s, and then within other networks of support to the liberation effort on the ground in the homeland. That this struggle abroad in the West is a daily, at times consuming, part of one's life and identity comes out clearly in another anecdote, opening the chapter of another contributors to the book, Randa Adel Fattah, and it occurs in Sydney, Australia. Generation after generation, people live in a Palestine that alternates between being here and there, as Randa beautifully comments when describing her particular struggle to defend her identity and her relentless wish to contribute to the struggle on the ground. And I quote, on the one hand, a claim by a Palestinian here in Australia to bear witness to what is happening in Palestine there. On the other, a claim by a Palestinian child here in Australia to control the here, to keep what is happening in Palestine there. Australia is also the opening situ for the next contributor in this volume, Samah Sabawi, who begins a poetic journey into history and identity from the Redlands coast of Queensland, visiting her aging father. It is where the history of the Australian settler colonialism and its genocide of the First Nation population meets the story of the Zionist settler colonialism and its ethnic cleansing of the indigenous Palestinians. The geographical and historical background are all the time consciously present in the life of a Palestinian woman who writes about and experiences daily the nexus between exile and trauma, and in the middle ponders on post-memory. This self-reflection helps Samah to challenge the erasure and denial and pass that determination for the next generation. And I quote, we cannot move on while our loved ones are under falling bombs, under siege and under occupation. So we do not, and we pass this on to our children, unquote. Palestinians drew courage, inspiration, and orientation from different sources. One of the most important ones is religion, whether they are Christians or Muslims. We have two such contributors next that tell that side of the liberation struggle. The first is the life story of Father Manuel Musallem. His biographical tale is a powerful antidote to any colonialist and apartheid regime attempts of a divide and rule tactics by attempting to drive a wedge between Muslim and Christians in Palestine. The British tried to do it, the Israelis are trying to do this. Theology of liberation is both Muslim and Christian, as Father Musallem writes, and I quote, I will resist from a religious standpoint stemming from my theology of my church and my strong conviction in this theology. Samuel Arian discusses Islam within a wider context of exploring the different parameters in which the liberation struggle can move forward without flinching in the face of difficult realities and current misbalances of power. The role of political Islam in the liberation struggle has been recognized by many. His contribution situates the struggle within a lifelong commitment of an intellectual who paid highly for his devotion in long terms in American prisons, including in solitary confinement. His intellectual reach is extraordinary, from deep knowledge of Western philosophy and profound knowledge of the Islamic visions and perception. Sami is not only looking at the past, he is viewing the future and believes in grand visions without which there is no hope for a proper liberation, a vision that is situated in Islam and much as it is in the general human values of freedom, humanity, and justice. Religion also inspired other contributors that is involved in the daily struggle to protect Jerusalem in general and the Al-Aqsa Mosque in particular as part of her liberation struggle, which is so relevant to what is going on today, yesterday, and the day before yesterday in Jerusalem, as we speak, is happening right now at the at Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem. Hanadi Halawani is a young Jerusalemite Palestinian woman who is a moving spirit and inspiration behind the Palestinian youth's determination to defend Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa Mosque. It is a tale of faith and religious devotion, but at the same time, it highlights how children and young Palestinians are enrolled in such a struggle at a place where massive Israeli presence should have prevented any form of resistance, and yet it exists. Hanadi's struggle takes place in the classroom, on the street of Al-Quds, and wherever she is when she is banished from Al-Aqsa. Faith is one's religion or nation, alongside incredible human courage, is what keeps the Palestinian political prisoners resilient and determined not to cave in to callous incarceration and denial of justice. As many of you know, many political prisoners in Palestine are already engaged in a very long hunger strike that continues to this very moment. Our next contributors, and to whose daughter we devote the volume, Khalid Gerard, was still in prison when this book was prepared and was denied the right of participating in the funeral of her beloved daughter. May she rest in peace, and to whom we devote this volume. And she was not able to attend the funeral of her daughter. From the way she tells about her trials and tribulation, one can begin to understand the power of conviction that keeps the political prisoners of Palestine steadfast in their ongoing commitment to the liberation struggle. All our contributors chose a route that inevitably demanded sacrifices and can end in martyrdom, imprisonment, or loss of home and one's career. The courage and resilience of those who have experienced the most brutal aspects of oppression is brought in this extraordinary piece by Khalid Gerard that was conceived within the four walls of an Israeli prison amidst torture and endless brutality. No self-pity, no hate, but just an incredible sense of commitment and show of resilience and hope. And I will end my contribution with a quote from Khalid's piece. While it is important that you must comprehend the suffering endured by prisoners, such as the numerous acts of physical torture, prolonged isolation, you must also realize the power of the human will. When men and women decide to fight back, to reclaim their natural rights and embrace their humanity. I will end by saying that, of course, I was not able to give you all the 29 incredible contributions we have in this volume, but I hope you get a taste of this mixture between the individual story and the overall contribution to liberation through resilience, sacrifice, and struggle, and a sense that you are passing this legacy to the next generation. So Palestine is not going to be wiped out, and the Palestinians are not going to disappear. And I will really end by recalling something that the very famous psychiatrist said to me in a conversation I had with him. And he was dealing with the issue of trauma and how we deal with trauma. And there's no doubt the Nakba, the 48 catastrophe, the ethnic cleansing, and the genocide that was part of it are a trauma, a collective trauma for Palestinians and individual trauma for Palestinians. And the ongoing Nakba, the ongoing catastrophe that has not ended in 1948 and continues, and we speak today here in Palestine, is an ongoing trauma. But this psychiatrist said that you cannot undo a trauma. You cannot undo the Nakba. You cannot undo the destruction of the villages, the massacres, the expulsion of people. You cannot undo everything. What you can make sure that you don't allow the trauma to define you. And I think what these stories show, that the Palestinians did not allow the trauma to define them just as victims of a terrible crime against humanity. They made sure that life is defined by their humanity, resilience, commitment to liberation, to overcome the consequences of the trauma, even if you cannot undo every aspect of what happened in 1948 and ever after. Thank you so much for joining us. And I hope those of you will be able to have the book, will, like me, would be in vow to those people who still devoted their life for the most just struggle on the globe right now. Thank you very much. And I will pass it to Hassanel, who will pass the floor to my dear, dear friend and colleague and co-author, Dr. Ramzi Baroud.
Thank you very much for participating. It's a good summary for what we actually will look forward to in the book. So without any delay, I would like to now give the floor to Dr. Ramzi Baroud to give his insights on the book itself and also on the issues of the Palestinian struggle. Dr. Ramzi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hassanel, and thank you to Professor Pape for this wonderful contribution, but also to all the work that he has put in this book, and all the work that he has done for Palestine throughout the years. We are all his students. We learned so much from him, and incidentally, the book is really about engaged intellectuals, and Professor Pape is, the engaged intellectual per, any academic definition and practical definition as well. The engaged intellectual, I mean, this is the kind of part of the title of the book, Engaged Palestinian Leaders and Intellectuals Speak Out. Why did we seek those 29 engaged intellectual, and what is an engaged intellectual? What is interesting is that in 2017, the term engaged intellectual became quite popular in Palestine. Just all of a sudden, not only academically, the term has been around for many years. Antonio Gramsci, Italian anti-fascist hero, made a lot of contribution to the concept of the organic intellectual, to the engaged intellectual. Edward Said wrote about the responsibility of the public intellectual. But in 2017 in particular, that term became omnipresent in Palestine, even among ordinary people. In Arabic, it is al-muthaqqaf al-mushtabik, the engaged intellectual. This was a result of a single man, a 33-year-old pharmacist by the name of Basil al-Araj. Basil al-Araj is from Bethlehem, a young Palestinian writer, intellectual, professional, who took it upon himself to stand up for injustice, like many Palestinian youth have throughout the years. But what distinguished Basil from others is the fact that he did what we, how we say in English, he put his money where his mouth is. He was not just sitting on a cafe shop somewhere or, elaborating about, theoretical frameworks of resistance. He was actually in the field fighting, and he died fighting. The Israelis killed him in 2017 while he was alone, fighting in his home. Israeli airplanes, helicopters were flying above, snipers everywhere. A large number of Israeli soldiers were surrounding his home, and he fought for 2 hours. And he left, when he was killed, there was a single sentence that he left behind, or a short paragraph. And what he says in Arabic is that وَأَنَا الْآنُ أَسِيرُ إِلَى حَتْفِي رَاضِيًا مُقْتَنِعًا وَجَدْتُ أَجْوِبَتِي. And now I walk towards my death, satisfied and contented that I found my answers. What are the answers of the engaged intellectuals, and what did Basil find, and why was he contented that he is walking to his death with that, with finding all the answers and finding the path to something bigger and above all of us? And the idea here then is to try to challenge the existing paradigm on Palestine. We also wanted to find the answers, and we wanted engaged Palestinian intellectuals from Palestine, from all over the world, to help us find these answers. Now, we are not claiming that these answers represent any sort of centralized strategy of the Palestinian people. We're not making that claim. But there is another path to finding an alternative Palestinian view compared to what exists today, compared to the one that is represented in the so-called Palestinian leadership in Ramallah, compared to the one presented by Palestinian factions and their factional agendas. We wanted to challenge all of this, and we wanted to move beyond, kind of remaining within this stifling conversation that's not taking us anywhere. I remember there was a statement by Edward Said, I think in Covering Islam, where he says that facts get their importance from what is made of them in interpretation, and that interpretation depends on the interpreter, and the audience, and the purpose, and the historical moment in which that interpretation is being made. But all that we know about Palestine doesn't come from the Palestinian people themselves. It comes from various interpreters. It comes from the Israeli state. If you look at any news media article about Palestine and Israel, quite often, you're going to find the Israeli point of view always ahead of the Palestinian point of view. You could have an Israeli soldier lightly wounded and 10 Palestinian killed, but somehow the mic always starts with the Israeli army spokesperson telling us, interpreting to us the event that has happened. The same thing, for example, Ilan mentioned, Professor Pape mentioned earlier, what has transpired at Al-Aqsa Mosque yesterday, the wounding of over 150 Palestinians, and of course the 12 killed Palestinians in the last 10 days or so, mostly in Jenin and other parts of the West Bank. But if you listen to CNN, you listen to Fox News, you listen to Sky News, it always starts with, the Israeli, government or the Israeli army spokesperson said that they have managed to pacify a terrorist who was attempting to do 1, 2, 3. If we are lucky, maybe there is a muted Palestinian voice at the very end of the article, and quite often you're not going to find that. The interpreter is also the Western media, the Western governments, Western officials, Western think tanks, Western spokespersons and talking heads. The interpreters are so many different representations that rarely include a Palestinian. I remember a Palestinian intellectual in Washington, D.C. told me once that for decades, every Senate hearing in the US Congress concerning Palestine never included a single Palestinian who testifies as a witness expert. The Palestinian voice is presented by some pro-Palestinian somebody, but it's rarely, if ever, there's a Palestinian. Now take that and measure it to every aspect of that representation and that interpretation. But what if the Palestinians represent themselves? And I'm not talking about Mahmoud Abbas. I'm not talking about the Palestinian Authority, the corrupt elites that benefited a great deal from the Oslo peace process. They have accumulated wealth, they have accumulated power, a very tiny little margin of the Palestinian people, while the vast majority subsist on so very little. Gaza, 2 million people living with practically nothing, extreme poverty, now with the war in Ukraine, food crisis. According to Oxfam, just a couple of days ago, there was a report that says Palestine has enough wheat to last it for 3 weeks. That was nearly a week ago. So we're looking at two weeks with no access to bread in Palestine. Who represents these people? Who speaks on their behalf and who interprets their reality to the world? So the book was our attempt to take that step. Number one, to start actually talking about Palestinian liberation. Liberation as it is, not to talk about the peace process and painful compromises and economic peace, as Netanyahu used to call it, and all of that. We wanted to talk about something real, something tangible, something that we know from a historical experience that it works. Liberation movements work. It worked throughout much of the global south, and it will work in Palestine, but we need to call things the way they should be called. It is liberation, it is decolonization, and that's what the conversation should be focused on. So that was really our mission. It was a very basic concept of bringing about a large number of Palestinian intellectuals, engaged intellectuals, representing many walks of life, and Professor Pape elaborated on that so beautifully, from archaeology to art to music to filmmaking to diplomacy and politics and history and media and interpretation and language, everything. Now, so many people who have read this book are quite happy with it, but someone emailed me slightly disappointed. He said, I was expecting that there will be a very clear strategy of what Palestinians need to do. And that was never the intention. The intention was not to tell Palestinians do this or do that. The intention was to say that we do have the intellectual capacity. In fact, the problem was we have too much intellectual capacity. The challenge was, how do we harness all of this into something that can fit in a single book? That we do have that intellectual capacity to represent ourselves. We are not spectators. We don't want to be in the audience. We don't want to be interpreted to or at or on our behalf. We want to be the interpreters. No factionalism involved here. No political interest involved here. These are people who have proved their worth to their communities and to the Palestinian people as a whole through decades, some of them literally through decades of hard work and sacrifices. Some of them are former prisoners. Actually, one of them, Khalid Gerard, was a prisoner when the book was being prepared. Some of them have been shot at, some of them have been wounded, some of them live in diaspora, some of them have been deported, they are not allowed to go back home, and yet somehow they carry on and they continue to be role models for generations of Palestinians. That's the idea. There is, and I know I most likely I have exceeded my time and I will try to cut it short here. There is, the book starts with a quote by Che Guevara in which he says, "Liberators do not exist. It is the people or the peoples who liberate themselves." Now, for us Palestinians, I remember I grew up in a refugee camp in the Gaza Strip. And I remember for many years, we have waited for the liberator. The liberator could be an Arab brethren, the liberator could be an international community that their conscience has finally awakened. The liberator could be some distant Muslim army coming from faraway lands to liberate us. And at the end of the day, we waited and we waited and we waited and no liberators arrived. And because of what happened since Oslo, this kind of lack of a centralized Palestinian leadership, truly representative Palestinian leadership, therefore no real vision or liberation strategy, many people, well-intentioned or otherwise, kind of stepped forward to speak to the Palestinian people, speak on behalf of the Palestinian people, telling us how to liberate ourselves. We need to be more like Mahatma Gandhi, more like Martin Luther King. We need to stop using violence. We need to stop doing this and we need to stop doing that. And we, desperate for support, desperate for solidarity, we looked and we nodded and we nodded and we said, yes, we will take your advice to heart and so forth and so on, because we are hoping that there will be some sort of a change within our political reality and Palestinians would finally rise in a real leadership to speak on our behalf. Well, that didn't happen. Something is happening in Palestine itself. A new young generation is rising in Palestine itself, and we wanted to take advantage of this historic moment. And we want to give them that book to the new Palestinian generation, to young people and activists throughout the globe. And we need to tell them we have a statement, a document that could guide you in your struggle for liberation in Palestine and your struggle on behalf of the Palestinian people in whatever locality, whatever city, whatever country you are in. We are here to speak for ourselves and we are capable of doing so, but we would love to engage with you. But the starting point has to be here. We have to be the interpreters of our own reality, as Edward Said had very much for listening, and Professor Pape and I would be happy to take any question you may have.
Thank you so much, Ramzi. Well, we triggered some questions already, so I will read them aloud and we'll start answering them. The first question comes from Roger, and it is, what are the best ways international solidarity organizations can support the Palestinian struggle? If I may, Ramzi, I would start answering that. For one particular reason, as Ramzi knows, Dr. Baroud knows, my own contribution to this book was my own take on the way the international solidarity movement with the Palestinians over the years contributed its share for the liberation struggle through my own personal angle on it. So Roger, this is a very important question, and I think that in all these dark moments that we are experiencing, especially in the last 10 days in Palestine, we shouldn't forget that as far as the civil society around the world and among the international solidarity organizations all over the globe, we have seen a very important move towards supporting the Palestinian struggle for liberation, and we are in a much better position than we were 20 or 30 years ago. Definitely, the international solidarity organizations, wherever they were and wherever they are, have contributed to a civil society all around the world that is aware of what goes on in Palestine, that is committed to contribute to the struggle for the liberation, And in that respect, we are actually part of a historical moment that should enable us to move things even more drastically and fundamentally on the ground, given the fact that we have a much wider and deeper and profounder international solidarity movement with the Palestinian struggle than ever before. But you're right, this is not the end of the story, and there's much more to be done. I would say, and very briefly, that there are three things that I can think of that are areas of activity that more can be done for the struggle, in the solidarity with the liberation struggle. The first area maybe is very, very understandable. While we have been able to make pathways into civil society and create a very clear conscience among many people in the civil societies all over the world, that Palestine is epitomizing struggle for justice and against injustice everywhere in the world, we have not yet been able to pass this message forcefully and in any significant way to the mainstream media, to mainstream politics, to politics from above, if you want. We are experiencing this incredible gap between policies of governments and political elites on the one hand, and the basic solidarity of societies on the other. It's a huge assignment. It's quite a challenge to transform the positions of politics from above, but I think we should work even harder on that point. The second point, we were able, through the help of movements such as the BDS, to make civil society a more proactive actor in the solidarity with the Palestinians. And I think actions of boycott, sanctions, divestment are a very important mode of action that galvanizes international solidarity beyond problems of disunity or fragmentation on the Palestinian side, or questions of representation and so on. This can always be done more. Much more can be done there. There are always periods where you can see more activity in this regard, and then there are some periods where there is less activity, maybe because other issues are occupying our attention or require our attention. But I think it's very important not to give up on this. This is one form of activity that I think you don't judge by dividends only. You judge by how much have you invested in it, rather than how much have you achieved. Because if you're just looking at the achievement, you might be sometimes disappointed, and sometimes unnecessarily be delighted with your actions, and then maybe do less than you should. Finally, the one area which we should really devote time and energy and together struggle against it. It's very clear how the Israelis are, what weapons the Israelis are using in order to make sure that the International Solidarity Organization do not impact, as Dr. Baroud was talking about, do not change the discourse on Palestine, the interpretation of the events, the language that is being used, that they are still continuing to disable any Palestinian agency and contribution to the discussion in the public domain about Palestine. One of the main weapons, as you all know, is anti-Semitism, is to allege that any criticism on Israel is either denial of the Holocaust, this is what's happening in Europe now, or just sheer anti-Jewishness or anti-Semitism. We know that this is a silly and insidious allegation, and yet we should nonetheless be able to face it, to explain, to get people's attention and struggle against these false allegations, and come back to the language that was used by most of the world, except the West, in the 1970s, that understood that Zionism equates racism, and therefore anti-Zionism is anti-racism. This is the language we have to recapture and insist upon, and not cave in and play the game of justifying ourselves and not being anti-Semites or self-hating Jews. We should take the initiative and go back to the language of anti-racism as the major issue that should unite everyone in the world who's against racism in solidarity with the liberation struggle in Palestine. Ramzi, you may want to add something on this.
Thank you, Professor Pape. I mean, you really pretty much covered it all. There's just one thing that kept jumping in my mind while you're speaking is just, I just feel like because of the way solidarity groups in many parts of the world kind of framed their narratives around the happenings in Palestine itself, they are quite often either inspired or demoralized by events that are far away from them, and they cannot really influence in a real and tangible way. And instead of focusing on what is possible within their own environment. What I mean by that is this. A while back, I was traveling in an African country, somewhere in the south. And I asked my host, you know, do you work with other Palestine organizations or pro-Palestine organizations within this part of Africa? And his answer was, not really, we work with the Palestinians directly. And I was troubled by that answer, even though my friend does a lot of incredible work. I was troubled in the sense that I know that Israel has infiltrated Africa for years now. Former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself takes a great deal of pride of kind of reconquering Africa. After Africa, many African countries cut their diplomatic ties with Israel following the 1967 war, and again 1973. And Palestinians have had such powerful allies, not just in Africa, but in the entirety of the global south. But that began changing, sadly, in recent years. And we began seeing Africa, including Africa as an example, but that covers much of the global south, that are normalizing with Israel, you know, opening, you know, very strong economic and military and intelligence ties with Israel. And some of them are either voting against Palestinians at the United Nations or abstaining from the vote altogether. And now anybody who's familiar with the history of solidarity with Palestine in Africa, and the fact that it was actually African members of the former African Union that in fact labeled Zionism a form of racism and lobbied at the United Nations and made it a reality at the United Nations and fought against every American attempt to change that definition until sadly in the early 1990s when the, you know, that definition was canceled, would be shocked to see what has happened in Africa as far as solidarity with the Palestinian people. Now, something went terribly wrong here. And as a Palestinian, I tell you that the problem started when the Palestinian Authority itself normalized and compromised and gave a lot of political, you know, kind of excuses for these other countries to come and say, well, if you Palestinians are willing to make peace supposedly with Israel, why shouldn't we? But of course, there is another reason why this is happening, is that the Palestinian solidarity in many African countries within civil societies that have been weakened tremendously in recent years. For me, the proper answer to work with for Palestine in, say, in Kenya or South Africa or Cameroon is to work within that local environment, within that regional environment. Now, this whole story to tell you that I think that as pro-Palestine groups, whether in New Zealand or in Australia, any other part of the world, I think Roger is writing from New Zealand, is to, you know, as the saying, think globally, act locally. The challenge for Palestine, for you in your country, is different than the challenge in Argentina or in Brazil. So you have to really think about how can you affect change in your own society, in your own country, for the sake of Palestine, and how do you build a network of movements based on the principle of intersectionality. Here in the United States, for example, many Palestinian groups have been working with other anti-racist groups, Black Lives Matter, for example, but various Native American groups, various groups that advocates rights of immigrants, refugees, and so forth. That intersectionality is so very important because it localized the idea of Palestine. It's no longer a faraway conflict in a faraway land where people have been fighting supposedly for thousands of years over religion. No, it becomes a local issue. So your challenge is to how to make Palestine a local issue that's relevant to your own civil society, relevant to your ongoing fights within your own society, and relevant to your own politics. And I think the moment you make Palestine a local issue or a political issue of your own country is the moment that Palestine will always remain on the agenda.
Thank you, Ramzi. I think that there are two questions which relate to the same topic, so I'll read them both, and we'll try and answer them. Steve asks, how much is the lack of European creativity in challenging US support for Israel is due to their unreconciled collective trauma, German especially? And Leila Pasah writes, so frustrating and sense of helplessness when governments do not condemn the ongoing violent and human rights violation committed by Israel. Even yesterday, mostly the Muslim and Arab countries respond. Media is so skewed. How can civil society come out stronger to condemn world order, whereas Ukraine-Russia conflict got huge attention from governments world over? Hypocrisy and unjust when it comes to the Palestinian struggle since '48. Maybe, Ramzi, you can begin by taking the Ukraine crisis and then comment on this within the general context of what we are discussing here. You have to unmute.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in many ways, what's happening, the tragedy, the tragic war in the Ukraine, which is, I mean, it is something that itself requires a lot of attention and focus. But I also think that it should allow us a moment to reflect on what is happening in Palestine as well. The fact that, for example, the events in Mariupol, as horrible as they are, have actually already been experienced in Gaza, in Jenin, in Khan Yunis, and in many parts of Palestine, time and again, year after year, for 75 years. And you can't even, let alone that Boris Johnson is not sending any lethal weapons for the Palestinians to fight, or the international community is using every possible sanction. Well, when I say the international community, of course, I'm talking about US-controlled and led and manipulated international community using every sanction. I think the last time I checked was about 6,000 sanctions imposed on Russia. Sanctions that we didn't even know existed in every possible field. And to think that we have been for years going after FIFA, the International Sports Federation, to symbolically not disallow Israeli membership, mind you, that's too much to ask, but rather to prevent outright racist Israeli football teams that are based in illegally occupied Palestinian land. Some like Bitar Jerusalem, for example, whose favorite chant is death to the Arabs, to block them or to prevent them from participating in FIFA events. And we were told again and again that politics and sports do not mix. Now, just marvel at this alone to understand and to fathom the degree of Western bias regarding all of this. I mean, how is that even possible? That Israel stands in violation of international law, that Israel has been condemned by the United Nations, the General Assembly, Security Council numerous times, despite of many attempts by the US and US vetoes to block such condemnations, that Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, even Israel's own Beit Salem human rights groups say Israel is an apartheid regime. According to Amnesty, not just apartheid within Palestine, Israel itself, but even outside, meaning that millions of Palestinian refugees are not allowed to go back because of their ethnicity, because of who they are as Palestinians. Yet we are to see a single item, a single victory, a single attempt by the West to actually hold Israel accountable in any way. Now, we could sit and talk about the double standards and reflect on the double standards and the hypocrisy for years and years, or we can go after these very organizations, entities, governments, companies, and remind them of their moral and political and legal responsibility. And of course, many of them are not going to change their position. And that's when you are important. That's when you come in. That's when civil society takes the lead on this and to decide to go after this organization. What's good for Ukraine should be good for Palestine as well, regardless of what sort of geopolitics is at work here. Human rights is human rights, and justice cannot be divided under any circumstance.
Thank you. I will just add one sentence and I'll go back to the questions. I just want to say that with all the sorrow of what's happening, of course, to the Ukrainian society and people, we should not forget that the same president who's now leading the Ukrainian people fully supported the Israeli destruction of the Gaza Strip. And that like so many right-wing Central European states whose Islamophobia and racism allies very easily and logically from their point of view with Zionism and Israel, are now experiencing something that the Palestinians have been experiencing actually since 1948, including in 1948. And this is something that shows us that a part of what we should do as activists is also know these histories, know what these people stand for, and so on. And I think we are able enough to navigate between our, of course, humanity in the face of any atrocity, any human suffering, and our ability as academics, activists, and intellectuals to contextualize in the right way in order to expose both the double standard and the Eurocentric attitude to human rights abuses and civil rights abuses, which are epitomized more clearly in any other place than in the way the West and especially Europe treats the suffering of the Palestinians over the years. I will take again two other questions. I think we still have some time. I hope I will be able to include all of them. Dr. Baroud, we have triggered quite a lot of questions, which is always a good sign. Hopefully we can cover as many as we can. I'll take two of them. Jorge Besada, I will go directly to your question, if you don't mind, Jorge, although you wrote a longer message. You would like to us to devote 2-3 minutes overview what we would like to see to fix this complex problem. Obviously, a new single state for everyone with equal right and so on, but what else? And I will add it to Rick Mansell's question, how important is the liberation of women and youth in the liberation of Palestine? So let me start very briefly, and then I'll pass over to Dr. Baroud. Both Ramzi and I are part of an initiative that has been going on for quite a while that obviously believes in one democratic state as the best solution, an idea that the PLO supported from the very beginning of the liberation struggle in the late 1950s and the 1960s. This is what was so unique of the Palestinian liberation movement that re-emerged after the Nakba, that it recognizes the right of every religion to be part of a free Palestine, never discriminated against anyone because of their religion or gender. By the way, if you look at the PLO charter, it's a very important issue there as well. And it was regarded by the West and by quite a large sections of the international community as terrorism. The very idea that the Palestinians asked for a democracy to be the basis for regulating the relationship between the settlers movement that colonized the country and the indigenous Palestinian, that the idea was not revenge, no retribution, but just building an egalitarian democratic society. We have to remember the West for years said this was terrorism, this was anti-Semitism. So we are still sticking to these ideas. We take into regard, of course, into account what happened in the last 100 years. We're not ignoring it. We recognize that there are millions of Jews that are living now in historical Palestine, but we need to decolonize Palestine. And you ask for a 2-3 minute review overview, so you understand that in 2-3 minutes, we cannot describe how each one of us understands decolonization, what does it entail, but there are principles, there are very clear principles by which a colonized society becomes a decolonized society, about its institutions, rectification of past evils, bringing back land that was robbed, bringing back people who were expelled, and building together a society. And this was not something unique to Palestine. People are trying to rebuild post-apartheid South Africa. Algeria was trying to rebuild itself after 100 years of French colonialism and settler colonialism. Palestine can learn from these experiences, but the principles are here important. That if you want to create a society that is not based on racism, apartheid, colonization, and oppression, you have to get rid of the ideology and institution that are at the heart of this. As for it, I think that you will find out, especially among the young Palestinians, that they are not forgetting of issues of gender or youth representation. It's very difficult, and you probably understand this, that in a daily struggle of survival, of existence, you can't bring to the fore every moment all the issues that a normal society should deal with. This is not just about women and youth. This is about social justice. This is about poverty. This is also about ecology. This is about being part of an Arab world that wants to deal with human rights and civil rights issues. Palestine always contributed and will contribute to changing oppressive realities, not just in Palestine itself, but in the Arab world at large. You cannot do it as long as you are under colonization and occupation. So you need to we all need to get the priorities right. Decolonizing and liberating Palestine is an important, fundamental stage in achieving all the other noble assignments that we as human beings have taken upon ourselves to create a more just and egalitarian society. I don't know, Ramzi, if you want to add something to this.
Yes, and I will do so very briefly. Professor Pape, you referred to the organization or the campaign in which both of us are participating. And just in case some of our listeners are interested, it is the One Democratic State campaign, and you can access the website at onestatecampaign.org. The other thing I want to say is that there are several people involved in the book who are also involved in the initiative. And that includes the Secretary General of the campaign, Mr. Awad Abdel Fattah, who writes an excellent essay about his vision for a shared future in Palestine and Israel. The other thing that I also want to bring up is the issue of women's rights. And I think that too itself needs to be decolonized. Just for the record, even though we were not really seeking a certain number of women contributors versus men contributors. And we were trying to also deal with the issue in quite an organic fashion, meaning that we find the best representative of this particular issue. We ended up having a majority of women contributing to the book. And that is just a reflection of the reality in Palestinian society. I'm not saying that we do not have problems. We do, like any other society. There are all sorts of struggle, that layers of struggles within struggles within struggles, and that is completely normal. And but that issue of women's rights in particular itself would have to be decolonized and would have to be claimed by the Palestinian people themselves. I'll give you like one short example. In 2019, I believe, it was when a Palestinian woman, Isra Ghuraid, was killed by a member of her family, and it was considered another honor killing in Palestine. As tragic as that event was, what it actually triggered in Palestinian society is an incredible phenomenon in which you had thousands of Palestinians protesting in every major Palestinian city in the West Bank and Gaza, but also in many Palestinian villages, localities, refugee camps throughout Palestine. This is not a Western-induced thinking on women's rights. The outrage was very much Palestinian, was very much authentic, led by Palestinian men and women. And the other thing that's really interesting about that phenomenon is that many of these people who were protesting, demanding accountability, demanding stricter laws that protects the rights of women in Palestine, many of these activists are also anti-occupation and anti-apartheid activists, which tells you that Palestinians have already figured out that women's rights, family rights, human rights, all of these basic rights in Palestinian society is part and parcel of the larger struggle against colonialism, against military occupation, and against apartheid, which tells you that Palestinian society, despite of everything, is quite healthy as a civil society, and it has the power and the energy to motivate itself and to bring change, whether at a macro level or at a micro level.
Thank you. We have a question which I think is important for someone who is anonymous, and that's okay. We respect people's wish not to be identified. Will it be possible for the Palestinians to act with one voice and mobilize together without a strong, charismatic leader to unite them? At the same time, is it possible to sway the Israeli popular opinion based on economic pressure, BDS alone, without an equally persuasive, charismatic voice like Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela to reassure them? Isn't Ukraine getting help because Zelensky's personal appeal has gotten the media's attention? Dr. Barul, maybe you'll start. I have something to say about this as well, very short.
No, I'm fascinated by the personal appeal of Zelensky. Really, I do not think it's Zelensky's personal appeal. I mean, we have to understand that there's a whole conglomerate of people, organizations, think tanks that are working to kind of create that personal appeal of Zelensky, the way he dresses, the way he talks. It's all choreographed, and you can tell that there's an American hand in all of that. That's not conspiracy theory. We have seen that happening in the past, especially, I mean, even the term Arab Spring, for example, was coined, and a lot of people do not know that, unfortunately, was coined by an American neocon in an article he wrote in an American media following the Iraq War, and the idea that Bush was going to bring democracy to the Arab world. The Jasmine Revolution, the colored revolution, the this and that revolution. There's a lot of choreography. There's a lot of kind of agendas written in advance. If the Americans are keen on finding a Palestinian face, a powerful Palestinian face, and present him to the media as a liberation hero, trust me, they will. And there are many, many Palestinians who are qualified and have the charisma and they have the power to speak and to articulate and to do all of these things. The issue is not that. The issue is that these charismatic leaders are in prison. They are assassinated. They are marginalized entirely. They are not allowed to speak. They're not allowed to represent their own people. We remember what happened in 2006 when Palestinians voted in a democratic elections, resulting in an outcome that bothered Israel and did not please Washington. And the result was siege on Gaza, sanctions on the Palestinians. Condoleezza Rice made it very clear that no money to the Palestinians will come unless this decision is reversed or unless this reality changes. So it's not that we are not really trying our very best. It's just the fact that our very best does not align with the agendas and the interests of the West and of the United States. So as a result, the answer here is not trying to present an amiable image of ourselves to the Americans and to the West, but to rather look deep into our own hearts and our own collective agenda as Palestinian people, and to develop a strategy that is good for the Palestinians, even though it might not get us money from Washington, even though it might not please the European Union, and so forth. The agenda should be Palestinian, by Palestinians, for Palestinians. And this is something that we have deviated from for many years, but particularly since the Oslo Agreement.
Thank you. I would also add, because the first part of the question was about Palestinian leadership also as something that might assure the Israelis and would unite the Palestinians. I think that we have to understand the historical context here is very important. The Zionist project began as a Christian project in the late 19th century, even mid 19th century. And ever since then, there is a coalition of evangelical Christianity with imperial interests, with Zionist activists among Jews, later on with American imperialism and so on, that create an unbelievable strong coalition that believes that there's nothing wrong in colonizing Palestine and dispossessing the Palestinian people. This international coalition is the one that allowed, with the help of the British Army, to create the foothold that Zionists had in Palestine before the First World War and after the First World War. And this is the coalition that sustained Israel as the strongest military power in the region, because on the moral ground, in the world after the Second World War, the idea that colonization, dispossession is something that is morally valid is impossible to justify. So we have to understand that. That means that even if the Palestinians had brilliant leaders, and I agree, sometimes they didn't have brilliant leaders, we all know that, and sometimes they had some very impressive leaders. Even if they had the best coalition of leaders that you can think of, you have to understand the balance of power, the global balance of power that dispossessed the Palestinians from their fate and destiny. So it is not an issue of leadership, to my mind. And in fact, I think the younger Palestinian generation understand it, and in fact shuns the idea of a strong leader or even a strong leadership. They are much more interested in an inclusive leadership, a representative leadership, one that fights the fragmentation caused by Zionism by reuniting people under the same agenda with the same vision for liberation, as the title of our book has it. And I think this is something that is important to understand, whether you're an active Palestinian activist on the ground or an international activist that support the Palestinian cause. We are facing a project of fabrication, of propaganda, of dispossession, of colonization, and we fight it with the human principles of justice, anti-racism, and anti-colonialism, not with strong leaders, but with strong principles, with strong moral principles. And yes, it's very difficult to convince cynical people that moral justice can win where power lies. I understand it. I have students who are already cynical at the age of 16 about the power to change things. But we have seen in the fight against global warming how young people are not deterred by the multinational explanation why there's no point in trying to fight global warming. There is a point of struggling for liberation and justice in Palestine. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I just want to summarize in one or two sentences our joint project and then thank everyone involved. I do hope that you will have access to the book because I think one of the worst crimes of any settler colonial project like Zionism is dehumanizing the indigenous native people. Zionism in Israel for years dehumanized Palestinian. A Palestinian baby can be a terrorist in their eyes, and they sell this commodity to the world. There is something in the in the individual perspective that humanizes the struggle for liberation and clearly shows the motives behind it, the humane motives behind it, the cry for normality, for life that is denied to people just because of who they are, not because of what they did, not because of anything wrong that they have done, but because of their identity and their geographical location at the place where Europe decided to solve the problem of anti-Semitism in the worst brutal possible way. And I think reading these stories, you will be inspired, as both Ramzi and I are, that there is a potential for a new leadership of the kind that I was talking about, a new unity, a new determination that will make sure that not only the struggle for liberation will continue, but that this struggle would project and influence struggles for human rights and civil rights all around the Arab world, which is in dire need for such struggles to succeed, to make it the place it used to be, a cradle of civilization, a light to societies as a whole. And as we know, in our international cosmopolitical world, there are the Middle East, the Arab world, Palestinians. We are everywhere. We are in Palestine, we are in London, we are in Sydney, we are in Seattle. This is the society we are struggling for, and Palestine epitomizes more than any other place, I think, this kind of struggle. I really want to thank particularly Hassanel, Ranjan, Nida, Junaid, who made this webinar possible. I hope to see you all in our next webinars of the MLN. And I want to mention Dr. Chandra, who is our inspiration and moral leader in this important struggle. Without him, we would have given up on doing these kinds of webinars and success. And I hope to see you all in our next webinars. And Ramadan Kareem, a good Pascha, and I hope we have some people who are celebrating Passover as well. Not just one self-hating Jew. I hope you have some other self-hating Jews around. we need to remember the three festivities. The Jewish liberation, talk about liberation in the Passover. I hope many Jews would understand that the next liberation is the liberation of Palestine for us as Jews, as human beings all over the globe. Thank you so much for everyone. Hassanel, maybe you want to kind of close it officially. And Dr. Baroud Ramzi, my dear friend, and dear friend, thank you so much. I know how busy you are, and we are so grateful for you for taking the time and sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ilan, and thank you everyone who joined us. Hassanel and Ranjan, thank you so much for organizing this and for all the fantastic work that you continue to do.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramzi, and to you, Professor Pape, for your wonderful insights, especially highlighting the importance of why we must always continue this struggle, especially when speaking about, for, and on the Palestinian struggle itself. And for everyone's note, I have put a link in the chat for where you may be able to purchase the book. It's available in many retail stores, and especially online platforms such as Amazon and Harvard Bookstore as well. So you can purchase directly from there. And for our Malaysian audiences, it's in the chat as well. It will also be available in Kinokuniya. So with that, I would like to once more thank Dr. Ramzi, Professor Pape, for joining us today. And we look forward to maybe having you again once more in a future webinar as well. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Salam.